Aniyanwea. Good morning, that's Cherokee. And it means hello, how are you? And thank you for listening to me speak about the principal people. Because that's what the Cherokee call themselves, Aniyanwea. It means the principal people. Cherokee is actually a mispronounced Creek word, Cherokee, which means people of a different speech. The Cherokee were once the largest of all the southern tribes. They numbered about 25,000 strong, and their boundary went from the Ohio River down through eastern Kentucky, which was a hunting ground for them, and we'll talk more about hunting grounds in a minute, into eastern Tennessee, western Virginia, western North Carolina, upper South Carolina, upper Georgia, and the northeast corner of Alabama. It covered about 135,000 miles. They were also a part of what is known as the 5 civilized tribes, which also included the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. And we are right in the heart of that country because they settled western North Carolina first. And the Cherokee will tell you that they've always been here and that the first man and woman, Kanate and Shalu, lived up on Pilot Knob in the Shining Rock Wilderness area. But history will paint a different story. Historians believe that the Cherokee are a branch of the Iroquois tribe and that they migrated south down through here. And when they got here, they encountered the Creek and the Yuchi Indian already living here. Now the Creek migrated around the year 1200 from Mexico up through the mouth of the Mississippi. And they lived in the Tennessee River Valley. They also were as close as Henderson County, because a misnomer is that Etowah is a Cherokee word. It's not. It's a Creek word. Today it means tribal town, but loosely translated back then it meant a major providence. And I can see where the Creek would settle Etowah because it's flat, it's close to the river. It would be a good place for a Native American town. Now the Yuchi were scattered all about. They were mostly along the Tennessee and Savannah rivers. And they're believed to be remnants of the mound builders. And I can believe that too because it was a practice that they carried on with them. They would still build mounds. So when the Cherokee got here and found the Creek and the Yuchi already here, the Cherokee were much like the pioneers in that they would take place names sometimes and keep calling it that same name. Because if you go to Cherokee today, Etowah has no meaning in Cherokee language. And that's another reaffirmment that it is a Creek word. I think that the Yuchi were probably roamed around the upper part of Transylvania County as well, because Tennessee, as in Tennessee Gap, is actually a Yuchi word. It means meeting place. Now the Cherokee kept that name, but they corrupted the meaning to mean place where the river bends. So when the Cherokee got here, they started driving out the Creek and the Yuchi Indians so that they could claim this mountain land for their own. So the Creek, and this took over hundreds of years. This wasn't an overnight thing. They fought with the Creek for hundreds of years. The Creek were their very bitter enemies. And they fought as far as where the French Broad goes into Buncombe County, because past the French Broad in Buncombe was the land of the Shawnee. And the Cherokee and the Shawnee never really warred. They respected each other's boundary lines. But the Cherokee thought that they could take the Creek, and they did. The Cherokee were large. They were a very fierce tribe. And so they drove the Creek down into lower South Carolina, lower Georgia, and on into lower Alabama. Now the Yuchi just scattered. The Yuchi were a very small tribe, and they were very easily overcome. They went west into Tennessee, and if you look at the Tennessee archives, they will tell you that the state of Tennessee is named after the Yuchi word, Tennessee. So I tease people when they tell me all the time that we're not spelling Tennessee Gap right. Yeah, we are. When you call it Tennessee, you're the one mispronouncing it. Yeah, we got it right. Although we didn't spell it correctly, Tennessee is actually spelled in Yuchi, T-A-N-A-S-I. And most of the pioneers who came here and were trying to wrap their tongue around Native American language, which is very difficult, They mispronounced a whole lot of words, and then when they tried to spell them, they were spelling phonetically, and I think that's why Tennessee has so many N's, S's, and E's in it. They were just trying to get a feel for it, because Tennessee is actually a very short word. So when they came to western North Carolina, they settled here first, and their very first town was Katua. It was at the junction of the Oconee and the Tuckasegee rivers. And Oconee is also a Creek word. It means Oconee people cut off. See, we think it's Cherokee because it is knee-deep in the heart of Cherokee country, but it's actually a Creek word. Oconee people cut off. We can only assume that this came from some kind of warfare that they were having with the Creek, and maybe the Creek held them at that point, and maybe it was the people from the Oconee town who was up trying to take that, because the Cherokee did settle very heavily in upper South Carolina, and literally right across the state line from Transylvania County with some of their largest towns down there. So when they found this area, which today, by the way, is right outside of Bryson City. If you know where Bryson City is, Katua was right outside of that area. So when they got there, they found a mound. And we know today that that mound was built by the mound builders around the year 1000. But the Cherokee didn't know that. But what they did know is it was a sacred place. And so they built their council house on top of it. And here they put their sacred fire. And that sacred fire, which they have kept burning all this time, still burns today on the Cherokee Reservation here in North Carolina and on the Cherokee Reservation out in Oklahoma. Now, around the 1820s, the Cherokee lost control of that land, and it became a dairy farm. And then later on in modern history, they added an airstrip over there, a grass airstrip. But in 1996, the Cherokee were able to buy that land. They paid over $3 million for it, but they got it because it is a very sacred area to them because it was their first town. So from Katua, they spread out along the river basins, settled in Swain County, Macon County, Jackson County, and of course, as I said, they were very concentrated in upper South Carolina. The closest they were to Transylvania County, and we want to talk about the Cherokee in Transylvania County, the closest they were here was up on Wolf Mountain in Jackson County. They had a town there called Tillanoa. They didn't actually live in Transylvania County because we were a hunting ground. And let's talk about hunting grounds just a minute. For the Cherokee, they needed vast amount of space for a hunting ground. There was a chief, when the 1785 treaties were signed, Chief Corntassel was trying to explain to the Europeans that it was different for them than it was for somebody who was farming, because somebody who was farming had their cows and their pigs kind of capsulated in one area. The Cherokee hunted wildlife, which needed a lot of room to spread out, to grow, to reproduce, to feed. They needed vast amounts of land for hunting grounds. So Transylvania County was a hunting and gathering area for them. But before we leave Transylvania County, we do have the myth of one town that was here. It was the town of Canasta, and today we pronounce that Conestee. It is said to have been located at the foot of Mill Hill, right where Island Ford Road intersects Greenville Highway. There is a legend among the Cherokee about Canasta, and they said that people once lived there. And then some Cherokee from another town up to, at Pilot Knob came to them and said, your town is in danger because there is disease and warfare about you that we fear will overcome you. We have come to ask you to come live with us on Pilot Knob and save yourselves. So the people of Canasta considered this. They had meetings about it. They finally decided to do it. They fasted for 7 days. They moved and were never heard of again. Now, this can be a very true story. It also could be that Canasta was one of the permanent camps. When the Cherokee came into Transylvania County to hunt and gather, they made permanent camps that they returned to year after year after year. In James Mooney's writings about the Cherokee, he talks about Canasta and said in the 1720s he found somebody, that he didn't, but that there was people living there. and by the 1760s, they were gone. Well, it could be, what time of year were you there? Were you there when the camp was there? Did you visit again when the camp was not there and they had gone back to South Carolina or back over to Jackson County? We don't know. It could have been a full-time town year-round. We just don't know. But anyway, we have carried that legend with us of Conestee. And now we have the development of Conestee up there, which all has Native American names for their streets, which is a little bit of a challenge. Just a little bit. And before we leave Conestee, I really do want to do some myth busting about the Cherokee today. And one is about Princess Conestee, okay? There was no Princess Conestee. Conestee Falls is not named because a princess threw herself over the falls over an unrequited love. I want to tell you now that the Cherokee were a matrilineal society. And in a matrilineal society, women have a very strong voice in government. Cherokee women actually own the houses and all the personal property. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute when we get into the clans. But a Cherokee woman would not ever have been denied the love of her life. It was mostly her choice of who she married. And so all these stories you hear of Cherokee women throwing themselves off a jump-off rock or any other, or drowning in Lake Jocassee, or any of these other stories that you hear, it's just not true. A Cherokee woman, A, would never ever commit suicide. How foolish. And B, she certainly wouldn't do it over a man because she would have had full control of her life. You know, nobody was denying her anything. So, but it makes a really good fireside tale. And I think that's how these things got going. I think because there was no name for this fall, you know, and it was close to the old town of Canasta, which we are now calling Conestee. It made a really good story, you know, that a princess would have jumped over the waterfall. And I think that's how they got going. Now, as long as we're on, the second part that is wrong with Princess Conestee is there is no such thing in Cherokee civilization as princesses. Because there are no kings, there are no queens, there are no princes. This is a European hierarchy civilization thing. Almost all Native Americans on the eastern seaboard, but especially the Cherokee, were a communal society. And when you're a communal society, that means that you take care of all the people, that no one person ever goes without. And when you're a communal society, you cannot have a hierarchy. You can't have aristocracy within a communal society. You can't have that kind of system in place. And they didn't know anything about it. They didn't know anything about it until the Europeans got here. And because the Europeans had to pick people of the tribe that were more important than others, they started naming like the war chiefs and the peace chiefs, of which we will also speak in a minute. These were men that were leaders of their town. And so they would start calling these people emperors and kings. And so therefore their daughters would be princesses. And it got so widespread that there are people who come up to me today and tell me that their grandmother was a Cherokee princess. And I smile very politely, but I'm thinking, no, she wasn't. There were no princesses. Your grandmother could, first of all, if it was your grandmother, she had to come straight off the reservation. You need to go back at least 5 generations. And there is some very serious Cherokee blood within the older families of Transylvania County. But they were just Cherokee women. They might have been a daughter of a war chief or a peace chief. We don't know. They just might have been a daughter of a Cherokee family. We don't know. They could have been a son of a Cherokee family. It wasn't just the women. So that we do have a Cherokee bloodline. But I'm sorry to report that nobody's grandmother, including my own, was a Cherokee princess. So that's some myth busting. Now, let's go back to the hunting ground. Because in Transylvania County, in hunting grounds, the Cherokee were great land stewards because they knew that their survival was solely dependent on the land that they lived in. It gave them all of their food, all of their shelter, everything that they needed. They farmed. And because they were a communal society, they had community gardens. They farmed probably about 2 to 10 acres at a time. If you see any Cherokee town, it would kind of be surrounded by cornfields, and then other plants would be down around the creek banks and the rivers and stuff where you could get to water easily and to give them water during drought. And one of the biggest things they grew was called the Three Sisters. Now, the Three Sisters was corn, beans, and squash. And the way they went about this is they would take their corn, and we all know how to plant corn. You get your little hill and you put your corn seed in it. They would take a fish head and put in that corn hill. I've seen my grandfather do the same thing. And then they would take 7 kernels of corn and put in that hill. Around the corn, in a ring around the corn, they planted beans because the beans would climb the corn stalk. And around the beans, they planted squash because squash has big, broad leaves. And so it shades the ground. It keeps it moist. It keeps the weeds down. And so these 3 things grew in harmony, and it was one of their very main crops. Now, besides farming, they hunted, they gathered from the wild. And because they hunted up here, their relationship with Transylvania County was well governed. I talked about canasta. Let's get over here. One of the biggest things they came up here for was to gather their river cane. Now, river cane used to grow all along our rivers around here. It was especially thick up in Toxaway. And river cane is a natural barrier for the rivers because it keeps the silt out of the river. It keeps debris out of the river. It keeps the water clean. It keeps the fish plentiful. But the Cherokee encouraged the river cane to grow on the rivers, and they had many uses for them. One was baskets. They made baskets out of river cane. And they would do a double weave basket, which they're infamous for. And some of them would be so tight that they could hold water. Some of them they did not weave as tight on purpose because they used it as a sieve. Some of them not so tight merely because it was a basket to store things or to gather things in. They kept their clothing in baskets. They kept their food in baskets. They used baskets for transport, going from one place to another to carry things in. It was, besides basket and pottery, were the only 2 tools that they had for household items. And the pottery they made from all the clay banks that we've got in Transylvania County. In the upper part, there's a particular place up on old Owen country that the clay up there is almost white on those clay banks. And so they would take this and make pottery, also to store food and cook in. You can't cook in a basket. So usually pottery was a cooking item, but storage was also the baskets. So they made baskets. The women always made the baskets. And they say that she had no pattern, that she took the pattern from her imagination and the traditions of her people. They stayed in Toxaway a lot. There is a place up in Toxaway that we still call Canebrake, which is at the edge of Lake Jocassee these days. And the last part of that river on the Toxaway River comes out flat and was an ideal place if you're traveling in a canoe, which you would want to do if you were up here gathering this stuff because you've got to have a place to put all this stuff so you can get it back to South Carolina. This is a good place to come ashore. And so they kept the cane cut back up there. They harvested heavily in that area so the cane did not take over Canebrake. And Canebrake, you can take that 1 or 2 ways. It's a place where the cane broke, or they call Canebrake is a place, is a name for a big patch of cane. That's what they call them, canebrakes. So Canebrake is still there and was utilized for the Cherokee. The other thing they did with river cane, besides baskets, is they made blowguns because they used blowguns to hunt small game. And the way they did this is a blowgun would be anywhere from 3 feet to 8 feet long, depending on what game you're hunting. And they would take this and heat it over the fire so that the membrane in between the joints became very dry. And then they would take a long stick with a very sharp point made for just such a purpose, and they would hollow out the blowgun so that the dart would travel through it. Sometimes they would take very hot small rocks and drop it into it and let it burn through the membrane. Then they would take for the dart, they used hard wood, usually oak, and they would sharpen the point very fine and harden that point again over the fire. And when the thistledown bloomed is when they did their biggest dart making, because they put thistledown on the end of that dart. And that way, when you put it in the blowgun, it made an airtight seal so that when you blew on the blowgun, that dart left the blowgun at a very high rate of speed. And they were very accurate with blowguns. So another use for river cane. Their third use for river cane was building. They built their houses out of wattle and daub. And wattle is simply river cane or small saplings or vines that they would weave together. And then they would take this entire structure and they would cover it in this same clay-like stuff that they got from the riverbanks. And that was called daub. And they had 2 houses in every town. Every family had 2 houses. They had their summer house, which was very loosely woven to let the air come through. Sometimes they would even cut little windows in it and stuff for light and stuff like that. And then and it was rectangular. And then they had their winter house, which sat right beside the summer house, and it was round. And it was very tightly woven. It was airtight with the daub on top of it. They used grasses or pieces of bark to make the roof. And they put the fire right in the middle of that. This was their winter house. Winter homes were very dark. They were very smoky. But it was a good place to get in out of the weather, because a house for the Cherokee was just a place to shelter. It was a place to sleep when it was raining. It was a place to get in and out of the cold, because they basically lived outside. But they needed shelter, so that's what their houses were for. So they put their fire right in the middle of it, because they knew a long time before Ben Franklin that heat radiates. And if they put the fire in the middle of the room, then the entire family can gather around the fire and keep warm. Unlike the pioneers, who would put their fire at the end of the cabin. So everybody had to try to scrunch up against the end of the cabin. You couldn't just sit anywhere, because if you was all the way over on this side, you were cold. So the pioneers didn't know to put the fire in the middle of the room. And if they did, I'm convinced it was the pioneer women who said, "You were not building that fire in the middle of my house, because it's messy." But the Cherokee didn't know that. So, river cane. The other thing they did is they fished, and they fished everywhere, along the French Broad, the Toxaway River, the rivers down in South Carolina, wherever they were at, they always built along the rivers for access to water and food. But they didn't fish like we fish. Fish is a sport for us today. And although we might eat our catch, it's not our mainstay of food. It was one of their mainstays of food. It was something that kept them alive. And so they cheated a little bit when they fished. They fished with poison. They would take walnut shells, which are toxic, and they would take green walnut shells and crush them and go to kind of a sluggish pool on the river where fish tend to hide out, and they would drop these walnut shells in the water. And the fish would absorb this poison through their gills, and they would just float to the top of the water. And then the Cherokee would just stand there and scoop them up in one of those baskets I was talking about. And there they had their fish, because they had to feed a lot of people. It wasn't, they weren't just feeding 4 or 5 people at their house. Again, communal society. They had to get enough fish for the town. And so they fished by poison. It doesn't mean they didn't know how to take their spears and go in and stab a fish for lunch if they were out hunting by themselves or anything, but that's not the way they normally done it. When they fished in the French Broad, they call the French Broad Longman, because he goes for a very long way. And it had very good fish because it had a lot of river cane growing along the banks, which is very conducive to fish. We're talking about their houses. In each town, Cherokee would build council houses. They would have a summer council house and a winter council house, exactly like their individual houses, only on a larger scale. And all council houses were built so that every single member of the tribe could sit inside of it. And they would sit there and talk. Anytime they had any kind of grievances, anytime they had any kind of decisions to make, or anything like that, they would gather together in the council house. And they would talk for hours on end. And the Cherokee considered it very rude to interrupt anybody while they were talking. Now today we'd never get anything done if we weren't interrupting each other. But the Cherokee thought it very rude, and when you were talking, you talked until you talked yourself out, and then somebody else could talk. And somebody asked me one time, didn't that take a long time? Well, sure it did, but what else did they have to do? They were sitting in that, seriously, they were sitting in that council house after they had their day's work done, after they had eaten There wasn't a lot to do in the evenings. The council house was a fine place to talk. It was also a place of entertainment. They would have plazas in front of these council houses, and this is where they took their entertainment because they danced. They held festivals. They played stickball, which was the forerunner of lacrosse. And so they gathered almost every evening in these council houses. Now the council houses, all these meetings were kind of governed by the white chief and the red chief. Now these two chiefs that run each town were chosen by the women of the town, matrilineal society. The white chief was the peace chief. He was the one that did all the negotiation. In the days of the treaties, it was the white chief came the most often to meet with the Europeans to treaty. They organized ceremonies. They worked to dissolve differences and disagreements among people. The red chief was the war chief, and he was in charge of all war preparation. He was the general of the tribe. The Cherokee honored their women. It's one of the reasons they were a matrilineal society, and I've always said it's one of the great ironies of the world is that in Cherokee belief system, all people are created equal. They believe that every man, woman, and child, they honored their children dearly. Every child had their own rights. Every woman, every man had their own rights. They were individuals, and all individuals had their own rights. And so they had a very hard time understanding European society when the treaties did start. Because when negotiations started, in the beginning, the Cherokee sent their women along with the war chief and the peace chief. And when they got to the negotiating table and there were no European women there, the first thing they said is, "Where are your women?" Well, the Europeans didn't bring their women because they had no say-so. And this was a hard thing for the Cherokee to understand. Why? The other thing they struggled with is how you could own a piece of land, because the treaties meant basically nothing to them. Cherokee sign, for go with God. To own a piece of land was a foreign concept to them. How do you do that? You were a steward of the land. You were only here for a short amount of time. You take care of the land that you live on, and then it goes to the next generation. So to have a piece of paper that says you own this land, this is why there were so many. There was over 150 treaties with the Cherokee. And the reason there was so many is because the government kept taking land, and every single treaty was going to be the last piece of land that they ever took, as long as the sun shall shine. But let's don't get off on treaties or we'll run out of time. Let's go back to, I could spend an entire hour talking about treaties. I wanted to tell you about marriage and divorce among the Cherokee. That's another reason that Cherokee women didn't commit suicide over a lost love. When you got married, it was a big, huge ceremony. A woman's brother would stand up for her in the marriage ceremony to show that he would take over the care of her children should anything happen to the husband. And the husband's mother stood up with him. It was a very long ceremony that we won't get into. But sometimes marriage doesn't work out. And so if a marriage didn't work out, or if a woman decided that things weren't going well and she'd rather be single or she'd rather be married to somebody else, it was her decision. It was her decision to get divorced. A man could not get divorced because that would have been considered abandonment of the family. But a woman could get divorced. All she had to do to get divorced is, because she owned the house and the personal property, she would take the personal property of her husband and set it outside the lodge. Done. Done. It's over. Now, we're going to talk about the clans in just a minute. When a husband married his wife, he went to her clan. He joined her clan. Again, matrilineal society. So when they got divorced, the husband had to go back to his own clan. He went back to his mother's house. And then both were free to marry again. The woman always kept any children. Let's talk about the clans. How are we doing on time?
About another 30 minutes.
Okay. So all Cherokee civilization centered around 7 clans. Again, communal society. When you have a communal society, everybody has to have a job. And so these jobs were done by families. Clans were a family business. And they had 7 of them. And I'm going to tell you about each one. In no particular order, by the way, because all things are equal. One of them was the Bird Clan, the Anijisqua, and these were the messengers. Now, each clan had a color that was associated only with that clan, and each clan had a wood that was associated only with that clan. So the Bird Clan, their color was purple, their wood was the maple, and they were the messengers. The Cherokee believed that birds were the messengers of the earth. They were also the caretaker of the birds because they used birds for meat, for decoration. They loved the feathers. It wasn't the Cherokee who hunted out the Carolina parakeet, who they called East-to-Toe. It was the pioneers who hunted them out because they sent them back to Europe to make ladies' hats out of because they had bright green feathers and red heads, and they were very, very colorful. The Bird Clan, if a warrior earned an eagle feather for his bravery in battle, only the Bird Clan could present this feather to him because only the Bird Clan could gather these feathers. These were the ones who were very skilled with the blowguns. These were the turkey hunters. These were the pheasant hunters and grouse. These were the ones who went out and killed small game. Another clan was the Blue Clan, the Ani-Ashoni. They were the medicine clan, and you can think of them as the pharmacist of the tribe. Their color was blue, their wood was the ash. They were the ones responsible for gathering herbs and medicines for the healers. We'll talk about them in a minute. They kept herb gardens that they cultivated. They made special medicines for the children of the tribe. Only a person from the Blue Clan could treat a child because children's systems, as we know, are very, very delicate. You could not give an adult dose of medicine to a child back then, just like you can't do it today. So only the Blue Clan would treat the children because they knew just how much medicine to give that child to help it instead of hurting it. In order to be a member of the Blue Clan, you had to know 400 to 600 species of plants and their interreaction with each other. When you went to gather plants for healing, they had a rule. You gather only every fourth plant. Because when you're out, let's say you're gathering ginseng, for example, you leave one plant to seed and repropagate. I can't talk this morning. Repropagate. You leave one for the wildlife, who will either eat it or destroy it. You leave one for your neighbor, who might need it more than you. And then you take the fourth one for yourself. They believed that any time you gathered roots, that you only gathered from the east side of the plant. They believed that the east side of the plant had stronger medicine. I think this is because, as a botanist, you know that the morning sun is the best sun for any plant. All plants love the morning sun. And so they thought that it had more healing power. This clan worked very closely with the Paint Clan, the Aniwodi. They were the healers. You can think about them as the doctors. Their color was white, their wood was the locust. And the reason they were called the Paint Clan is because they made poultices, and often medicine was actually painted on the body. If you had wounded yourself and you had this gash on your arm, they would put a poultice, which they said they were painting. They would paint medicine on this wound in order for it to heal. And that's why they were called the Paint Clan. Now, a healer had to be a botanist and a herbalist. The medicine man always came from this clan. Training for a medicine man takes 15 to 20 years, unlike our doctors of today. It was something that was handed down. You would be an apprentice as a medicine man for a very long time of your life. You would start as a young man and probably not be fully trained to go out on your own until you were at least middle-aged. One interesting thing I ran across when I was researching the Paint Clan is in the Smithsonian, I found some paperwork they were recording Cherokee practices at that time, and the Cherokee actually practiced acupuncture. They used the needles from porcupines, or they used very sharp thorns, and they knew how to do this. And so this doctor had written a paper, and he called it a barbaric practice, absolutely barbaric, when any, and I quote, any civilized person knows that the proper method is bleeding by leeches. Okay, who's civilized, who's not here? Then we have the long hair clan. They were the teachers, the Anigilowi. Their color was yellow and their wood was the beech. They were a very peaceful clan. The peace chief always came from this clan. Well, not always. I will qualify here that there is no such thing as always, because as things traditionally, the peace chief came from this clan, because as the Cherokee changed and interaction with the Europeans started kind of redefining their civilization, sometimes peace chiefs and war chiefs would come from different clans. But traditionally, a peace chief would come from this clan. The long hairs, the teachers, taught the way of the Cherokee to their children. They were also responsible for taking in any strangers, because when the Cherokee were at warfare and they would capture Creek Indians, they never tortured them or anything like that. They were very civilized people, but they would capture them and bring them back to the town, at which point those people would just be absorbed into the Cherokee society. And so it was up to the long hair clan to teach these new members of the tribe the way of the Cherokee. Then there was the Wild Potato Clan. They were the farmers. They're the ones out there growing the Three Sisters. Their color was green. Their wood was birch. They were the keepers of the land. They were the gatherers. The wild potato was a main staple of Cherokee diet, and that's why they're called that. They farmed for the entire community. They were a very low-key clan because there's not much to tell about them. They farmed for a living, and therefore they fed the tribe. Then there were the Deer Clan. They were the hunters, the Niawi. Their color was brown. Their wood was the oak. Historically, it was always the Deer Clan that went out to hunt meat for the tribe for the winter. And I want to talk about Cherryfield here a minute when I talk about the Deer Clan, because it was members of the Deer Clan that would come to Cherryfield. One of the ways, and I don't think we even went back to that, but we talked about blowguns, but the other thing that the Cherokee used was bows and arrows, obviously. And this was to kill larger game like deer and elk and buffalo. And yes, we had buffalo on the eastern seaboard at one time before it was hunted into extinction, just like they did in the plains. In fact, there is the legend among the Galloway family that when they came to settle this area in the late 1700s, there was still buffalo on East Fork. It's one of the reasons they settled East Fork, is because the game was so plentiful up there. We had elk just as much as you see deer. We all see deer all over the place today. Elk used to be that plentiful here. So bows and arrows, and they made their own, of course, and they liked granite for arrows because it was hard. It chipped very easy, or flint. Chipped very easy, made very sharp points. And what they would do to take care of the land to entice hunting conditions, they would do controlled burns. And this was a very, very old practice where they went in and burnt all the underbrush in an area. And this would do 2 or 3 things for them in land management. It took out all the undergrowth. And if anybody has lived here long enough, you'll know what I mean when I say a laurel hill. This is where the laurel grows so thick that you literally cannot travel through it. So they burnt those out so that they could pass, so that they could travel. Also, if you burn out all the undergrowth, then new growth comes up. Grasses will come up. Grasses for the deer and the elk and the buffalo to feed on. There's a tradition among the Glazner family that says when they got to Cherryfield that the grass was as high as a horse's withers, which would be about yay high. Fields of it, fields and fields of it. Mr. Ziegler, who has farmed up in Cherryfield for 1,000 years, has one of the most, maybe not 1,000, but has one of the most extensive arrowhead collections of anybody in Transylvania County, because for all these years, every time he plows his fields, he picks up the arrowheads out of them. And he has a massive collection. The other thing that controlled burns do is they bring in berry bushes. Berry bushes will come back, blackberry bushes, blueberries, they will come back after a controlled burn and grow more prolific. This attracts birds, this attracts small animals, and so the food chain begins. because not only did the Cherokee use the berries, so did the birds, so did small wildlife. And it was very important to the ecosystem that these berry bushes survive. And so controlled burn would bring those out. So the hunters, the deer clan, would come up into Cherry Field every year, and they would have the fall hunt, because by this time, the game was so plentiful because of land management. And I'll diverse just here a minute just because of this group. Land management was so very important to them. When the first pioneers and settlers came to Transylvania County, they were drawn here because of the clear water, because of the bountiful game, because of how easy it was to live in Transylvania County. They had everything they needed. Well, guess why? The Cherokee had been practicing land management in this county for 400 years. They had been practicing land management. And so, yes, it was a little piece of Eden here. And that's what attracted our first folks, including my own family. So the Deer Clan also were messengers because they were very fast on their feet. They were also out and about. And so they were responsible for delivering messages from one town to another. If you lived in Tillanoa and you wanted to get a message to somebody in Oconee, a member of your Deer Clan would be your best bet because they're out and about hunting anyway. So they were the messengers. And last but not least, we have the Wolf Clan, the Aniyawa. They were the warriors. Their color was red and their wood was the hickory. They were, without a doubt, the largest of all clans because you always want a large army. The war chief always came from this clan. The Wolf Clan were the ones that were left behind when the Cherokee started scattering, when the Trail of Tears came. And we'll talk in just a second about that. But a lot of them hid out in the mountains, and they just didn't go. Almost all of these people were from the Wolf Clan because they were the survivalists. And they were the most fierce. They would paint their faces with ashes from the fire. They would do like an ash, which would be white like this, and then they would take charcoal from the fire and they would come down like this. And they wore feathers in their hair, and their hair was very long and free. And they were a very fierce-looking warrior when you came across about 1,000 of them at one time. And this is something that gave all pioneers pause for thought. So that was the 7 clans. Within these 7 clans, all Cherokee civilization was able to function in a normal level because you had everything you needed. You had your doctors and your pharmacists and your teachers and your military and your farmers, all of things that we could not do without today. You know, if those jobs were still not available today, we would struggle as a civilization even now. I want to talk just a second about spirituality. The Cherokee were a very spiritual people, and they celebrated nature as a part of their daily life. They had 6 main ceremonies a year and lots of little ones in between. But they had the first new moon of spring, they had the green corn ceremony, the mature corn ceremony, the great new moon or fallen leaves festival in the autumn, the friends maid ceremony, and then the beginning of winter. And the only 2 I want to talk about is the green corn ceremony, which is one of my favorite because it happened in around July when the first corn started coming up and you knew you were going to make a corn crop. All the women of the tribe would clean out their houses. It was like spring cleaning. They would take out the robes. They would clean up any broken pottery. They would cleaned out everything. While the women were doing this work, the men went to the council houses and done exactly the same work. Because again, everybody's equal. You know, there is no such thing as women's work, men's work. So the men would clean out the council houses. So they had the entire town is all nice and clean. And then they done a very important thing. Anybody that you had a grievance with, you had to hunt that person down and resolve that grievance because you could not go to the green corn ceremony with any kind of ill feelings towards anybody in your town. It just wasn't allowed. And so they did this. They worked out all their problems. The other one I love was a daily ceremony that they had. It's called going to water. The Cherokee were an extraordinarily clean people. They bathed every single morning of their life. So when you hear about, Native Americans being nasty and stuff like that, they were 10 times cleaner than Europeans. Europeans had we joke about a bath on a Saturday night, but that comes from the truth. Europeans did not bathe on a daily basis because it was too hard to carry the water in. The Cherokee went straight to the river, and they bathed every single morning of their life. They called it the going to water ceremony. And when they went to this, the one thing they did was they let everything go. Any ill feelings they had towards another member of their tribe, any feelings of anger, any feelings of jealousy, any feelings of resentment. They let all this go away with the water every morning. And I was so enamored by this ceremony that probably about 10 years ago, I started incorporating it into my morning shower. Because I shower every morning because I'm a clean person too. And so in the morning shower, I let everything go. I give it up. I let it go away so that I'm not mad at anybody. My feelings aren't hurt from anything that anybody said. I don't feel resentment. I don't feel jealousy. I just let it go because that was yesterday. It's over. It's gone. And I cannot tell you how this has changed my attitude in life. It's a very freeing thing, and I strongly recommend it.
Because you work with kids before.
I had to every day. I was like, please, God, don't let me go in and kill this man today. No, we all know we're joking here. Okay, I want to wrap up by talking about the eastern band of the Cherokee today. These are the people that are left behind on the Trail of Tears. They were the people that received land under the Treaty of 1817 and 1819, which were allowed to remain in North Carolina. And some other time, if you get a chance to hear more about the Cherokee, I'll tell you about what happened then, because there was a very great chief then, Drowning Bear, who had long insight for his people. And he made a pact with the government that his people would stay and not cause any problems, and they would farm for a living. I love the part that the government wanted to teach them how to farm. Seriously. But it's true. The government did want to teach them how to farm, okay? These are the same people that saved the Pilgrims from starving to death when they could. Okay, but anyway, we won't go there. But anyway, Drowning Bear said that they would live peacefully among the Europeans, and so they were allowed to remain. Almost all of these people wound up over around Robbinsville, and they're the Snowbird Cherokee today. There were also some Cherokee who were exempt from the Indian Removal Act. Then there was the Qualla Boundary. And Drowning Bear, how much time we got? Because I need to make this fast.
Anytime.
No, well, okay, I'll go quick.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Then
Drowning Bear adopted a white boy who had lost his father. His name was William Holland Thomas, and he raised him as his own son. And because William Holland Thomas was a white man, he could own land. But because he was raised by the Cherokee, he was very cognizant of the situation that they were in. He actually studied law. And so he bought all the land that is today the Qualla Boundary. He bought it in his name with money supplied by the Cherokee, but he bought it in his name so that they could create the Qualla Boundary. Google him sometime and look him up, because without William Holland Thomas and Drowning Bear, we would not have the Eastern Band today. They just simply wouldn't be here. Then there were the ones who hid out in the mountains. Then there were the ones who came back, because when they did go on the Trail of Tears, many of them just kind of left the Trail of Tears. Some of them went all the way to Oklahoma. Yanagusta was one of the chiefs that came back all the way from Oklahoma. Some of them walked every step of the way. Some of them hid out in Tennessee and circled back and came back. So this is where all of our current Cherokee came from. Today they're preserving their heritage with the Qualla Arts and Crafts, the Museum of the Cherokee Indian, immersion school. They lost their language. And in 2001, they opened up immersion schools where they are teaching children, just like all children are taught, but they're teaching them entirely in the Cherokee language. And so they are able to hold on to that because it's leaving. So I could talk on and on and on. If you want to know more, I do teach down at Blue Ridge Community College. I teach a course in the Cherokee. It is 6 weeks long. and my next course starts in March. So we have any time for questions, or you got to get to your meeting?
No, we'll take questions.
Okay.
But first I want to say there's a very fine DVD of Yvonne discussing Cherokee available in
There
the
is.
county museum
Mm-hmm.
office. I might have had a hand in that.
You did. You had a big, huge hand in it.
I did. I was the interviewer. It's a very
You were.
nice interview, and if you're studying Cherokee heritage and whatever you do, it might be good to take a look at. Thank you, Dan. Good luck. He's got another meeting at 10 o'clock after.
You had a question there in the back.
Yeah, I just had a question a couple times. First of all, thanks for the talk, it was very interesting.
The what?
You talked a couple times about going into the hunting grounds or
Mhm.
prepared, hunting animals, for the winter and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
I was just wondering what their methodology of preserving meat was over time.
Drying. Later on, as they had European interreaction, they learned about salting, but drying mostly. And they ate almost immediately. They didn't kill a lot. One thing about hunting for the Cherokee is they would hunt in very small quantities. They didn't take more than they needed right now. And when they killed an animal, they held ceremony over that animal. And they thanked that animal for its contribution to the people. And then they proceeded to use every single part of that animal. I mean every single part. The bones, the hides, the meat, everything was used. And so by the time they used up this much meat, then they would hunt again. And so they dried it, was really the only way they had of preserving. But they didn't preserve that much, they just went and hunted more.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, to repeat the question, it's what was the method of preserving meat for the Cherokee when they went hunting? Okay, anybody else quickly? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned the burning they did to
Mhm.
manage for game and vegetation stuff, and then you also mentioned the river cane. But maybe if you could talk about how they managed the plants for river cane and any other management they did for plants, like for medicinal plants and things like that.
Well, they cultivate, okay, he wants to know how they manage their plants in the harvesting of plants. So for most plants, they just made sure that they didn't outstrip their resource in the wild. If they knew where there was a patch of yellow root growing, for example, this is why they went in, took only every fourth plant. They didn't outstrip that resource so that it would keep propagating and continue to grow. And so they knew where it was at. Sometimes they would actually use a controlled burn around areas that they really wanted plants to grow in, like you had a gigantic patch of yellow root. And you might take, to keep things from encroaching on that patch, you might do a little controlled burn around that. As far as cultivation, they kept some herbal gardens for that specific purpose, just to make sure that they had some handy. Plants controlled burn, they actually used to try to help the plants in the ecosystem that they had created. But they didn't really plant anything that we wouldn't consider a garden vegetable today. The herb gardens, they would transplant, they would plant their vegetables. But the rest of it, they just made sure that wherever it was at out in the wild, that they kept it there. And see, river cane, you can cut river cane off at the bottom all day long, and it will come back next year because it grows from the roots. It grows all underground from the roots. And so it's hard to, the only way you can destroy river cane is to plow it up. That's the only way you can get rid of it. And so this was not something they did. Anybody else, and we'll let everybody get on with their meeting. Yes, Lee.
Yeah, how did they control the burns?
Now that is a question I would love to know my own self. To my knowledge, how did they control the burns is the question. To my knowledge, with manpower, they would burn to a water source, from one water source to another. They would do what we do today. They would dig ditches. What do you call that?
Fire breaks.
Fire breaks, thank you. They would dig fire breaks to keep it from getting out of control. They did control burns about every 3 to 5 years, and so it wasn't massive control burns. It wasn't a massive thing. They kept it under control enough that they weren't burning that much. And one of the reasons they did controlled burns too is to keep wildfires from happening, because it used up the ground material that we see in fires. Wildfires get out of control because there is so much dead wood on the ground that acts as fuel. So they would get rid of this. This also helped the rivers because it didn't go down into the river. We have problems with river because too much debris gets washed down the banks and goes into the river. So if they had these controlled burns that would use up all that ground fuel. Yes, sir?
Okay, poison walnut shells in the fishing pools,
Mhm.
people downstream from that, were they affected?
No. Lee asked if the people downstream were affected by fishing by poison walnut shells. And the reason is because it dissipated so very quickly. They only use this in stagnant pools because it lasted that long. You know, it would go down through the water, it would hit the fish, you got your fish. The minute it hit rapid running water, it just dissipated. It dissipated so that it wasn't an issue.
I guess my last question is, I've been wrestling with the idea that the winter solstice is a pretty fixed time, but anyone else who's ever tried to fix it has been 3, 4, 5 days, 2 weeks off.
Mm-hmm.
So what day do the Cherokee celebrate the beginning of winter ceremony?
I want to say it's the 21st. Now,
So they are the first ones besides the Aztecs who have nailed that.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. They were smart. They were smart. Yes, sir.
Can you tell me about their relationship with the chestnut, how much they relied on it, and if they did anything to?
Not any more than they did the acorns. Now, we were talking about controlled burns. Acorns is one of the things that they did controlled burns for. But the chestnut was a sacred tree to them, not as sacred as like the cedar, for example. The cedar was very, very sacred to the Cherokee because they buried their dead on it. Chestnuts was mostly for the wood and for the food. But there were many trees. See, they didn't make the distinction. See, we have developed a taste for chestnut. I'd rather have a chestnut as an acorn any day of the week. But to them, the acorn was a more useful nut because they made flour out of it. But to my knowledge, they didn't do anything special with the chestnut.
Was there a chief Toxaway?
There was not a Chief Toxaway, and I'll tell you why. There was not a Chief Toxaway. That lady did not drown in Lake Jocassee, and there was no such thing as an Eastatoe band of Indians. There was a Cherokee band of Indians who lived in Eastatoe. All of this came about from a man named William Gilmore Simms, who wrote a book in the 1800s called The Cabin and the Town Hawk. Simms had been in Transylvania County, and he took place names, he took people's names, and he wrote a fictional story about the Cherokee and the Long Hunters. He had met James Fisher of Transylvania County, who was a Long Hunter, and had made a friend of him. And so he took all the knowledge that he gathered up here and he made a work of fiction. If you look it up, it is listed under fiction. If you read the intro to this book, Simms said in his own words, it is a work of fiction. But what happened is because we knew every single place name in that book, we took it as the Word of God. This is the way it was. This man knew he lived in the 1800s. He knew he was here. He called it Toxaway. He knew that the Eastatoe band was there. Chief Toxaway was the chief of the Eastatoe Indians. Okay, both of those are very real names. But there was no Chief Toxaway, and no, he's not buried up in Toxaway. I've been to that grave. That is not Chief Toxaway that made the paper up there. It is, however, in my opinion, a Native American grave. But there was no Chief Toxaway. There was anything that you see on stuff like that, and you cannot believe how often it's been repeated. Do your homework. Look up Simms. It's fiction. Yes, sir.
William Gilmore Simms was the Mark Twain of the day. That's why I was so.
Yes.
But,
Yes, he was.
Is there effort to locate these old Native American graves and be able to document it into our cemetery heritage that we have?
Absolutely.
There are folks that know where graves exist, and this is gonna be lost, you know, and I'm sure several lost by now, just the knowledge of passing down, but.
The question is there an effort to preserve Native American graves? Absolutely, and you're looking at one member of that team. I belong to Transylvania County Cemetery Committee, and one of our many, many chores of the preservation of all cemeteries in Transylvania County is that we are locating, marking, preserving any Native American grave that we find. Anybody that knows of one that they would like for us to come see, by all means call me. We were instrumental in saving Chief Toxaway's grave from the blade when they were doing all that road construction up there. They were going almost straight through that area. And somebody contacted the cemetery board, and we went up there, and we took an archaeologist up there, and we met with the DOT, and we went through many gyrations. And at the end of the day, they fenced that area off and went around it. And so whoever that is up there, it's not Chief Toxaway, but whoever that is up there will remain undisturbed for my lifetime, and I hope for everybody's.
Resting easily.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Yeah, got one back here?
What do those graves look like? How do you know if you've seen one?
Okay. What you would want to look for, the question is, what does a Native American grave look like? Okay, one, the Cherokee, sometimes they're not as many as what you think there might be, because sometimes they were buried underneath the threshold of their homes. A chief was almost always buried underneath the threshold of the council house. But if you were out and about, say you were on a hunting and gathering trip and something happened, then you would be buried at, wherever you fell. They would pick a pretty spot, and that's where they would bury you. But they only dug, after they dug the grave, which I'm really not sure if it was a total 6 foot. I think that's a little deep for them to go. But they would get you underground, and then they would pile rocks all over top of you. And this is sometimes why it's hard to tell, because as the years have gone by, those rocks move because the earth moves. And so sometimes they get displaced. Sometimes people don't know what they are, so they carry them off. That's a really good rock and would look good over my fireplace. They get carried off. But if you find them, the one up in Toxaway was almost totally intact with rocks. And I know of 2 more in the upper end of the county that are totally intact with their rocks. And so you want to look for a space the size of a grave like this table, covered in rock, big rock. Not just little rock, big rock.
Stacked up.
Stacked up. And what that was for, it's very simple. Just keep the animals out of the grave. It's just that simple. Just keep the animals out of the grave. Yes, sir.
What about marking trees?
Yes. Oh, yes. I love this. The way that the Cherokee kept their trails marked is they would take trees, especially young saplings, and they would bend them so that they would grow in different shapes. Like maybe here's a sapling coming up here, and they might take that and twist it or bend it or hook it over here or tie it off or something, so that that tree might grow up like this and then over like this and then out like this, or they might be intertwined or something like this, but they would mark them. And these were trail markers, so that when they got to that tree, they would know to turn here if you were going in this direction or you wanted to go to this town. There would be a path from this town to that town, and you might get to a patch of woods and you're not sure exactly which way to go. There would be a tree there that was marked in some kind of unusual design, and that would tell you that this is the trailhead and to follow that tree to the next town. There are some great tree examples. They're almost all gone, but there are some great examples up around Highlands and Keishers. There's still some up there. What else?
Other questions?
All right, guys. I appreciate all your time this morning. I'm going to let you get on with your meeting. Thank you. Thank you very much. What else?
Before anybody leaves, where's my signing sheet?